On December 21, 1945, as winter pressed down on Washington, a brief and somber phone call cut through the stillness of Dwight Eisenhower's office. The voice on the other end carried no dramatic flourish, just a plain and irreversible fact. George Patton was dead. It took only a few seconds for the words to land, but the emotional impact was years in the making. For Eisenhower, it wasn't just the death of a general. It was the end of a volatile, exhausting, indispensable partnership, one that had shaped the fate of armies, nations, and entire continents. For 3 years, he had walked a tightrope, disciplined his most effective battlefield commander publicly, relied on him privately, and spent every scrap of political capital preventing the man from detonating his own career. Now Patton was gone, and the war hero who had once commanded millions felt a kind of exhaustion that no battlefield could produce. Eisenhower, for the first time since 1941, no longer needed to measure every word about Patton. He no longer needed to defend him to politicians, soothe the British, reassure the War Department, or pretend that the controversies had been merely unfortunate distractions rather than potential disasters. And in the weeks and months that followed, when the reporters had moved on and the eulogies were fading from the newspapers, Eisenhower began to say what he truly thought, what he had buried for years under diplomacy and necessity. Patton had not merely been good, he had been irreplaceable. In the brutal arithmetic of war, where results mattered more than etiquette, Patton had been the closest thing the United States possessed to a force of nature. Losing him felt, in a quiet and private way, like losing the war's most devastating weapon. But to understand why Eisenhower felt this so deeply, one has to travel back to a time before the stars on their collars, before the conflicts that would define the century, before the press conferences and the political headaches. Back to 1919, to a field outside Camp Meade in Maryland, where 2 young captains, one aristocratic and assured, the other plain-spoken and earnest, discussed the future of warfare over grease-stained engine blocks. Patton was already a combat veteran of 2 theaters, born into a legacy of military service and wealth that insulated him from fear and doubt. Eisenhower was a Kansan farm boy who had trained for the Great War but never seen combat, and who felt he needed to prove himself in quieter ways, with intellect and discipline rather than battlefield valor. Patton would talk fast, ideas spilling over about how tanks could change everything, about speed, shock, mobility, and the psychological power of a machine that could move faster than infantry and punch harder than cavalry. Eisenhower would nod, argue, refine those ideas, approaching the same vision from a more strategic angle. Patton often joked that Eisenhower was the brain, while he was the muscle. But even then, their dynamic had already formed. A theorist and a practitioner, equally convinced that warfare was poised to shift from horse to engine. The Army, however, saw tanks as toys, indulgences left over from the war that had just ended. Senior officers reprimanded Eisenhower for pushing armored concepts too aggressively. They warned him that his career could evaporate if he continued down that path. Patton, who didn't need a paycheck to survive, kept pushing. Eisenhower, who did, learned the value of restraint, of holding opinions behind his teeth until the time was right. 23 years later, those 2 captains would stand at the pinnacle of military command in Europe. Eisenhower, now Supreme Allied Commander, saw war not as a contest of individual units, but as a vast and fragile coalition held together by diplomacy, logistics, and constant negotiation. Patton, commanding first the 7th Army and later the 3rd, saw war as a contest of wills, speed, aggression, momentum, shock. The friendship of 1919 survived, but it lived inside a cage of power and responsibility. Eisenhower now had the weight of nations on his shoulders, and with that came the impossible task of controlling a man who despised being controlled. Patton believed Eisenhower had become political, too cautious, too eager to placate the British or the State Department or Roosevelt himself. Eisenhower believed Patton had become a liability in peacetime contexts, yet utterly indispensable on the battlefield. They still understood each other better than any 2 officers in the Allied chain of command, yet they were now bound by a hierarchy that guaranteed tension. That tension burst into public view in August 1943, during the Sicily campaign. Patton, having moved at speed across the island, visited field hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering psychological collapse. What modern doctors call PTSD, what World War I had introduced as shell shock, and what the U.S. military of 1943 labeled combat fatigue. Patton, in his unforgiving warrior ethos, saw these men not as casualties but as failures of nerve, and in 2 separate incidents he slapped soldiers, berated them, and threatened them at gunpoint. When the stories reached American journalists, the explosion was immediate. Senators demanded answers, newspapers denounced him, and the War Department feared that keeping Patton would hand ammunition to Axis propaganda. Eisenhower faced a decision that no doctrine could address: fire Patton and remove one of the only commanders capable of executing high-speed armored warfare at scale, or defend him and risk public outrage. Eisenhower chose the middle path. He reprimanded Patton formally, forced him to apologize to both soldiers and medical personnel, and required him to publicly express contrition before his entire command. It was just enough to quell the storm. What Eisenhower could not reveal, what he could not even whisper outside the walls of his private office, was that the Army could not afford to lose Patton, not with Italy still contested, not with France on the horizon, not with Germany beginning to shift to total defensive war. Eisenhower knew that the invasion of France would require commanders capable of exploiting breakthroughs faster than German command could react. He also knew who that commander would be, yet that defense came with a private sting. Eisenhower did not entirely disagree with Patton's view that war demanded extraordinary psychological endurance, though he found Patton's method barbaric and unacceptable. Eisenhower's own letters reveal frustration with the Army's approach to psychiatric casualties. He wanted better screening and training, though he lacked the freedom to overhaul the system mid-war. But nuance had no place in politics. Eisenhower had to condemn, punish, and distance himself from Patton's actions publicly, while privately ensuring he remained in the roster for future operations. It was one of the earliest examples of Eisenhower's burden, protecting the war effort not only from German divisions, but from the political consequences of one man's unfiltered personality. The next year, this burden grew even heavier. With the invasion of France approaching, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, one of the most ambitious deception operations in military history. Its purpose was to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. And at the center of that deception sat George Patton, because the Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. German intelligence analysts had studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, had watched him punch through defensive positions with speed and improvisation, and had concluded that wherever Patton went, decisive action would follow. So Eisenhower handed Patton a role that was simultaneously crucial and humiliating: command of a fictional army group equipped with inflatable tanks, fake barracks, and radio operators broadcasting nonsense. Patton loathed it. To him, Normandy was the great event of the war, the moment when all their theories about mechanized warfare would be tested, and instead he was paraded before plywood landing craft so that German reconnaissance planes would photograph illusions. Eisenhower could not tell him that this humiliation was saving lives on the beaches, that the Germans would hold back divisions for weeks because they feared Patton's phantom army. Patton would learn that only after the war, and even then it left a bitter taste. He wanted battle, not theatrics, impact, not strategy by proxy. Yet Eisenhower needed him precisely because of his reputation. In war, perception is a weapon, and Patton's name alone was worth divisions. When Patton finally returned to real command, it was as if a dam burst. On August 1st, 1944, the U.S. Third Army became operational, and what followed was a demonstration of armored warfare unmatched in modern European history. Patton's columns slashed across France, liberating cities faster than maps could be updated. Prisoners and equipment were seized in numbers that stunned Allied planners. German commanders wrote in disbelief about the speed of American mechanized forces, convinced that Patton must have been supplied by some hidden reserve of fuel and ammunition. But in truth, the Third Army lived at the edge of logistical collapse every single day. Eisenhower, watching from headquarters, felt both pride and dread. Pride, because the theories they had whispered over engines in 1919 had finally become reality. Dread, because Patton was outrunning not only his supply lines but the ability of other Allied commanders to coordinate. Bradley, steady and methodical, preferred balanced lines. Montgomery, cautious and aristocratic, refused to attack until every contingency was in place. Patton treated war as motion. Any pause was a gift to the enemy. He harassed Eisenhower's staff officers for fuel, for ammunition, for permission to push deeper into the German heartland. "Give me gasoline and I'll win the war," he said more than once. Eisenhower, who had to juggle not only American logistics but British demands, Soviet agreements, and Roosevelt's political expectations, often found himself symbolically pulling reins on a racehorse that wanted nothing but open fields. Privately, Eisenhower sometimes confessed that Patton was probably right, that momentum had a quality all its own, that war was won by relentless pressure more than by diplomatic arithmetic. But the Supreme Commander did not live in the realm of if only. He lived in the realm of coalitions, where Montgomery needed fuel for Market Garden, where French civilians needed liberated ports opened, where Soviet armies demanded recognition of future political boundaries. Patton had no patience for those calculations. To him, war was a window, open briefly, closing quickly, and Eisenhower was letting it close inch by inch. By the winter of 1944, that window appeared to slam shut altogether. On December 16th, the Germans hurled their reserves into the Ardennes in a desperate counteroffensive that caught the Allies by surprise. Communication lines snapped, divisions crumbled, and for a moment it seemed as if the Axis had found one last breath of fury. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting at Verdun with his top field commanders. The mood was bleak. Bradley looked stunned by the scale of the assault. Montgomery discoursed on the need for preparation and caution. Others spoke of stabilizing lines and waiting for weather relief. Then Eisenhower, in a voice stripped of any pretense, asked Patton how soon he could attack. The question alone stunned the room. Patton's army was positioned far to the south, oriented for offensive operations in a different theater. The idea of pivoting multiple divisions 90 degrees through winter roads, disengaging from active battle, and then mounting a counteroffensive into the German flank was, by all conventional measures, lunacy. Patton did not see it that way. He opened a small notebook, consulted handwritten contingencies he had drafted days earlier, and stated a date, December 22nd. 3 divisions, 72 hours. The room fell silent. Bradley shook his head, certain the estimate was bravado. Montgomery doubted aloud that such maneuvers were even logistically possible. Eisenhower, however, simply nodded and said, "Make it happen." Patton did. On December 22nd, in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, the Third Army struck the German southern flank at Bastogne and began to turn the tide. Soldiers trapped inside the town would later say they felt the offensive before they heard news of it, as if the very sound of American armor in the distance signaled that the world had not abandoned them. That moment validated every impossible choice Eisenhower had made to keep Patton in the fight. All the reprimands, the apologies, the political gymnastics, suddenly, in that winter offensive, they became the price of victory. When disaster loomed, Eisenhower knew only one commander would attack without hesitation, without fear, without waiting for the weather to clear or the staff to calculate odds. That ability could not be taught. It could only be managed. During the war, Eisenhower's public descriptions of Patton were always measured. He praised him for battlefield accomplishments, but never in a way that suggested singular genius or indispensability. He could not afford to. He commanded an alliance of egos, cultures, and national priorities. He needed Montgomery to feel respected, Bradley to feel valued, Devers and Patch to feel included, and the British government to believe that American command was impartial. To single out Patton above the rest would have been a political earthquake, but privately, something very different took place. Staff officers recorded that during high-level planning sessions, Eisenhower would occasionally pause and say, almost to himself, what would Patton do? Not because Patton always represented the optimal solution, but because he represented a unique dimension of thought, the dimension of audacity. Patton forced the Supreme Commander to consider options that others would dismiss as impractical or reckless, and in war, the improbable sometimes achieved what the careful never could. Yet the relationship between the two men was becoming increasingly strained as victory approached. Patton, unburdened by diplomacy and intoxicated by momentum, saw no reason to slow down simply because the enemy was collapsing. Eisenhower, however, had to think about what came after the guns fell silent. The world was dividing into spheres of influence. The Soviet advance into Eastern Europe was altering the post-war map, and every mile gained had implications that would stretch into decades. When Eisenhower pulled supplies from Patton to give to Montgomery for Operation Market Garden, a gamble that ended in failure, Patton was furious. He believed Eisenhower had allowed political considerations to outweigh operational logic, and he said as much in private conversations with his staff. To Patton, war was like hunting. Once the quarry was wounded, the hunter should strike the killing blow, not pause to negotiate who held the knife. But Eisenhower's horizon was longer than the battlefield. He had to think of Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, the French, the British public, and the incoming post-war order. Patton believed Eisenhower had become overly political. Eisenhower believed Patton had never adapted to the reality that armies were now instruments of nations, not merely machines for defeating enemies on open fields. The irony was that both were correct within their own frames. Patton was built for war. Eisenhower was built for peace. When the guns finally did go quiet, the dangerous mismatch between Patton's personality and the new political context became impossible to ignore. Germany lay in ruins, occupied by Allied powers who were not only trying to govern a defeated nation, but also preparing for the cold, tense equilibrium forming with the Soviet Union. Patton, who had no patience for ideological complexities, began to view the Soviets not as allies but as the next enemy. He told journalists that the U.S. Army should rearm German divisions and prepare to fight the Red Army. He described denazification policies as short-sighted and argued that the real threat to Europe was communism, not the remnants of Hitler's party. These statements, incendiary in public and diplomatically catastrophic in private, forced Eisenhower into an impossible position. The very traits that made Patton brilliant in war, clarity of purpose, contempt for compromise, instinctive aggression, made him a crisis in peace. Eisenhower relieved Patton from command of Third Army and reassigned him to a lesser position in Bavaria, effectively a demotion. Patton felt the sting at once. To him, Eisenhower's decision was the ultimate betrayal. The friend he had debated engines with in 1919, the comrade who had once valued his insight and audacity, now condemned him for speaking truths he believed the world needed to hear. Patton could not comprehend that his truths, however sincere, could destabilize a fragile post-war order. Eisenhower could not explain it without revealing classified diplomatic realities. And so their last conversations were heavy with misunderstanding, with symbolic weight neither fully acknowledged. Patton left Europe convinced that the political world was not merely misguided, but cowardly. 12 days after a car accident near Mannheim, Patton was dead. The funeral was small by the standards of his fame, attended by soldiers who had followed him through dust and snow, through rapid advances and desperate winter marches. Eisenhower was thousands of miles away in Washington, listening to the news in quiet disbelief. They had not reconciled. There had been no final, clarifying moment. Patton had left life in the same abrupt way he led his armies, without transition, without compromise, without easing into anything. In the weeks that followed, as condolences arrived and newspapers published eulogies, Eisenhower found himself reflecting not publicly, but privately, on the man he had spent years trying to direct, divert, restrain, and unleash. He spoke candidly to friends, to staff officers, and to his own papers in ways he never had while Patton was alive. He admitted that directing Patton had been the hardest part of his command. Not because Patton was disobedient, he never disobeyed direct orders, but because he was unpredictable in all the spaces between orders. Eisenhower had to protect Patton from his own impulses, from British outrage, from American politicians, from journalists hungry for scandal, from situations that could have derailed entire campaigns. And yet, despite all that, Eisenhower confessed that no other commander could create effects on the battlefield like Patton. Other generals moved divisions. Patton moved outcomes. Eisenhower had spent the war ensuring that Patton never became the story. After Patton's death, he could finally say that Patton had often been the difference between victory and stalemate. He even admitted in private correspondence that some of his own decisions to slow or divert Patton haunted him. He wondered whether faster exploitation after the breakout from Normandy could have shortened the war. He wondered whether giving Patton priority over Montgomery during the pursuit phase might have prevented German forces from regrouping behind the Siegfried Line. These were not regrets born of insecurity. They were the private calculations of a supreme commander who had lived with consequences that the public would never see. Years later, when Eisenhower wrote his memoir, he used a word that no senior Allied commander had ever publicly attached to Patton during the war: indispensable. That word carries a weight that military professionals do not apply lightly. It means that without that individual, the outcome changes. Eisenhower meant it. In his mind, Patton was uniquely suited to the kind of warfare that dominated 1944 and 1945: fluid, fast, chaotic, dependent on tempo and initiative, rather than static planning. Most generals thrived in predictable conditions. Patton thrived when predictable conditions collapsed. He had what Clausewitz called coup d'oeil, the intuitive grasp of battlefield possibilities that cannot be taught, cannot be bureaucratized, cannot be standardized into doctrine. But Eisenhower also understood the darker symmetry. The man who was indispensable in war was impossible in peace. In peacetime, armies need diplomacy, patience, and quiet professionalism. Patton possessed none of those qualities. He was born for conflict, not for its absence. Eisenhower once remarked to a colleague that Patton was like a razor, magnificent for cutting, disastrous for anything else. It was not an insult. It was recognition of design. When Eisenhower became President of the United States in 1953, steering the country through the fragile early years of the Cold War, he never again commanded armies in battle. But on more than one occasion, in interviews near the end of his life, he returned to discussions of Patton. Not the scandals, not the controversies, but the winter at Bastogne and the pursuit across France and the spirit that animated those operations. He spoke about the burden of restraining someone you need, about the contradiction between what wins wars and what keeps alliances together, about how command is not merely decision-making, but the management of talent, ego, and risk. For Eisenhower, Patton embodied that contradiction more starkly than anyone else. The war had forced him to balance two realities that the public rarely considered: that some men are built for victory, but not for stability, and that commanding them requires a kind of emotional labor no manual can describe. Eisenhower could not talk about that during the war. It would have sounded indulgent or personal. After Patton's death, the emotional truth became harder to hide. The cost of managing genius is that you never get to use it freely. The burden of command is that you must restrain the very force that might deliver your greatest triumph. America did not fully appreciate what it had lost on December 21, 1945. History books would list Patton as a brilliant, controversial general. Documentaries and biographers would recount his victories and his scandals. But Eisenhower, who had watched him from the vantage point of supreme command, understood something deeper: that Patton was a kind of weapon, unpredictable, expensive, volatile, devastatingly effective. Weapons like that make victory possible. They also make peace difficult. In the end, the story of Eisenhower and Patton is not simply a story of one man controlling another. It is a story of two men who began as equals, who dreamed together about the future of war, who walked divergent paths into roles neither could have predicted, and who found themselves entangled in the moral and political architecture of a global conflict. It is a story about the weight of responsibility and the loneliness of leadership, about what it takes to harness genius without allowing it to burn down the house. Patton never questioned the legitimacy of war. Eisenhower did. That difference defined them. Patton believed that war clarified human purpose, that it burned away the trivial and revealed the essence of man and nation. Eisenhower believed that war was the failure of diplomacy, and that victory meant nothing if it did not lead to a just and durable peace. Patton's clarity was tactical. Eisenhower's clarity was strategic, and in that difference lay both their friction and their complementarity. If Patton had lived into the Cold War, one can only imagine the political storms he would have generated. If Eisenhower had lost Patton before Normandy, one can only imagine how much slower the Allied advance might have been, and how many more lives would have been lost. Those counterfactuals are not idle speculation. They are the measure of how interconnected these two men were to the fate of the war. In the end, Eisenhower would never say publicly that he loved Patton. Soldiers of that generation did not use such language. But in his private recollections, in the way his voice softened when he spoke of Bastogne or Sicily, or those long-ago days at Camp Meade, it becomes clear that Eisenhower's grief was not merely professional. It was personal. He had not simply lost a general. He had lost the only man who truly understood the dreams they once shared, before rank, before politics, before history itself placed them on opposite sides of responsibility. Patton died frustrated and unfinished. Eisenhower lived to see his country through new dangers, always aware that victory had required men who did not fit easily into a peaceful world. The tragedy of Patton and Eisenhower is that they needed each other most when they could least speak honestly, that their mutual respect could only be fully expressed after one of them was gone, and that the qualities that made Patton a legend were the same qualities that guaranteed he would never sit comfortably in the world he helped shape. War elevates certain men and destroys them in the same gesture. Patton was elevated, then destroyed. Eisenhower survived but carried the knowledge of that paradox for the rest of his life. And if the Supreme Commander ever allowed himself a private moment of reflection, he might have admitted that for all the burdens, the controversies, the apologies, and the sleepless nights, he would not have wanted to win the war without George Patton at his side.